Everybody, it's Dakota, and today we're going to be going over another one of these Pioneer decks that are probably going to be around for the foreseeable future. Chonky Red, or Big Red, as it is normally called. Essentially, what you're doing in this deck, you're basically just a bigger version of Mono Red. You have some staying power in the mid to late game, but you also have definitely some draws where you just kind of like overload your opponent and kill them, even through some pieces of interaction. So really we're gonna go over this deck list and kind of some changes that you could possibly make to this deck if you wanted to take it to either your local Pioneer event or even take it bigger to some of the opens, maybe even some of the SCG Classics, things like that. So interestingly enough, like the very first thing, Soulscar Mage over the haste creature Monastery Swiftspear. Essentially, for this and the kind of the theme you'll see for this deck, you're not trying to be super aggressive, but you have these draws where you can just be super aggressive. And Soulscar Mage is kind of like this happy medium of aggressive one-drop creature and a card that has some staying power in the mid to late games. So the big thing and the big reason to play this card is the effect of when a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, you put -1/-1 counters on it instead, and you put that many on it. So Wild Slashes, Lightning Strikes, and Stomp become these effects that really just give it -1/-1, or yeah, -1/-1 counters on those creatures, and makes combat difficult for your opponent when you get a prowess trigger as well from a Soulscar Mage. The fact that if they attack with a 4/4 and you shock it and put two counters on it, and then you get a trigger 2, and Soulscar Mage gets to beat that card in combat, and you obviously still get to keep your Soulscar Mage. So that's why you see them playing Soulscar Mage over Monastery Swiftspear. You could play Swiftspear in this deck, but then it kind of changed the texture of the deck and everything, and definitely makes you more into the aggressive plan than you do the mid to late game like staying power that this deck has. Another one, Kari Zev, and this is where a creature that is kind of bad in the mid to late games, but definitely helps you poke in for some damage and get your opponent to a low enough life total where some of your bigger things, if they stick around for more than a turn, just kind of end the game as well. So Karizev is a 2-mana 1/3 first strike menace creature, so it plays defense very well as also attacking and getting in there. And it creates a 2/1 token, a red token named Ragavan that's also tapped and attacking, and it gets exiled at the end of combat. So with Karizev, like you attack, you're more than likely getting in for 3 damage every turn, and a 2/1 creature that it creates, the Ragavan token, can also trade up with some of your opponent's creatures as well, especially in like the mono black deck, and even some of the creatures in the mono green deck, like the Mana Dorks and such. And you don't care about losing the token, obviously, because you just get it again once you attack again with Karizev. So this card really just kind of like pushes through damage, makes it hard for your opponent to block, makes playing defense a little bit easier too, with first strike on the Karizev if you decide to not attack with it for whatever reason. Also works well with Torbrand, because the Ragavan token is also red and Karizev is red. So when Karizev deals her damage, she's going to deal 3 first strike damage, which is usually enough to like kill most creatures in the format anyway. And then the monkey deals 4 damage, which again trades up even higher with more cards, and if they just don't block or remove any of it at all, like they take 7. So that's pretty good and pretty aggressive, and kind of shows that like while this card is definitely meant for the early game, there is some utility to having it in the late game and mid game as well. Bone Crusher Giant, Goblin Chain Whirler, Goblin Rabblemaster are definitely like definitely fit the theme of when you play these. You can play this card on turn 3, or you can play it on turn 8, and it's going to be great. So Bone Crusher Giant, probably the least exciting of the 3, has the utility of being a removal spell before it's a big 4/3 creature that punishes your opponent for targeting it with spells by dealing damage to them. And if the spells don't kill it, then it just gets to hopefully deal another 2 damage or trades with something. But then it's still like 2 for 1, 3 for 1 to your opponent, which is really good, especially in a deck where you have cards like Goblin Chain Whirler and Goblin Rabblemaster. Chain Whirler in conjunction with Soulscar Mage can just put a bunch of negative counters on your opponent's creatures, and obviously with a 3/3 first strike creature, makes combat very, very difficult for your opponent as well, because it makes blocking very bad for them. It makes attacking very bad for them. So Chain Whirler is probably, on its own, probably one of the best creatures, certainly at least like the top three, because these other two cards I'm going to talk about here are probably the best ones. Speaking of top two, Goblin Rabblemaster is probably my pick for the best creature in this deck, simply for the fact that if your opponent does not answer it and it goes unchecked for any number of turns, this card is just going to win the game. So Goblin Rabblemaster makes other goblin creatures you control attack each turn of Fable, which you're only really playing Goblin Chain Whirler as like your only goblin card, and the other copies of Rabblemaster. And at the beginning of your combat, on your turn, you make a 1/1 with haste, so then that creature is going to have to attack. And then whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking goblin. So Goblin Rabblemaster by itself attacks for 1 with the token it makes on turn 3 when you play it. And then on turn 4, with Rabblemaster plus the pumps it gets from the goblins, you're attacking for 6. And then you're just attacking for 8 the next turn. You just end up attacking with more and more damage as the turns go on. And then even if Rabblemaster leaves behind 2, 3, even 4 goblin tokens after your opponent deals with it, that's pretty good, because you're still chipping in for that damage. And going again with like following it up with like Torbrand, which this card is just nuts when you get any semblance of a board or able to stick this card for over multiple turns, that even these goblin tokens that, the 2, 3, 4 that you have are now essentially 3/1s, that just end up like blowing up your opponent's opposing opponent's creatures, on top of just getting in for tons of damage if they really don't want to trade resources to deal with these tokens. Before really getting to Torbrand, I'm going to talk about Rekindling Phoenix for just a quick second, because Rekindling Phoenix is a surprisingly really good card in the format. Remembered in Standard because it takes like it's essentially like 2 cards to deal with this thing. It's a walking 2-for-1, and if your opponent wastes 2 cards trying to kill it, that's 2 cards they're not spending on killing Torbrand or Glorybringer or even Goblin Rabblemaster if it's in play. So like Rekindling Phoenix definitely eats removal spells very nicely, and even if they don't, or they just kill it to get it off the board, it'll come back with haste the next turn at the beginning of your upkeep, and just again gets in for damage. So when your opponent really cares about this card, it opens the door for a lot of your other creatures. It's played as a 1-of because a lot of your creatures are just technically better value wise, but this card definitely is going to be a lightning rod in the games that you see it for your opponent's removal spells. Torbrand nuts in this deck. I'm not going to go over him too much. Just makes all your red creatures that are also really aggressive and really powerful even more aggressive and more powerful, and makes it pretty game ending, honestly. Glorybringer, probably your second best creature in the deck. 5 mana 4/4 flying haste, already pretty good. The fact that you can exert it, which means it won't untap during your next untap step, can deal 4 damage to a non-dragon creature that an opponent controls. So you just end up clearing the way for your ground creatures. Like if you attack with this Inkari Zev and your opponent has 2 creatures, like you can just have Glorybringer blow up the bigger of the 2 creatures, and then they can't block the Kari Zev, so you're getting for at least 5, and then they possibly have to trade their creature if they want to block the Ragavan. So, I mean, in that scenario I just created, like, you're dealing either 7 damage or your opponent's taking 5 damage, and then they're losing their creature, which overall is great for you, because then the Glorybringer doesn't have to exert, or doesn't have to untap the next turn, because if it just gets to attack and kill a creature every other turn on top of just dealing your opponent 4 damage, then it's more than doing its job, and it's definitely punching the clock and going to work. And another card, like with Torbrand, like it deals 6 damage, which kills just about everything in the format as well, if you compare Torbrand with a Glorybringer. Hopefully, if you do that, like, your opponent's just dead. But most of the time, like, curving Phoenix into Glorybringer, or Torbrand into Glorybringer, or like Rabblemaster into Glorybringer, whatever the case may be, you're just kind of running down your opponent. It can run them out of the game, especially that they lack the answers of dealing with these cards. Going to the other non-creature-y spells that are in the deck, Chandra, Torch of Defiance, super value Planeswalker, really freaking good. House and Standard. I don't know if it's going to be a house in Pioneer, but definitely your card advantage, your removal, and even some ramp to be able to double spell as early as like turn 5 with Chandra in play, and then the emblem is just game ending if you ever get to do it. So, really good card, definitely worth the inclusion in the deck, especially since you're not this super aggressive red deck. You are this kind of like red deck that can have these aggressive draws, but in the mid to late game can just shut your opponent out. Wild Slash, Lightning Strike, just some cheap burn spells. You could exchange Wild Slash for Shock, and you lose very minimal utility. I mean, like Wild Slash obviously has like the upside of having a 4-power creature, but it doesn't really ever come up all that much. So if you have Wild Slashes, play them. If you don't, play Shocks. That's fine. Lightning Strike, just a 3 damage burn spell for 2. You know, it's really good. Lightning Strike has always been a pretty good card. Not enough wizards to make Wizards Lightning good, so Lightning Strike is probably the next best option. And then for the fun of Ember Cleave, this card is great with Rabble Master, great with Chain Whirler, great with really any of these creatures, just for the fact of giving you a double strike and trample. It's just especially good with Rabble Master because if you attack with multiple goblins, then you can just kill your opponent essentially in one shot with Ember Cleave on turn 4 of the game. So really good, really powerful card. Better than the Teamer Battle Rage for the fact that this is just a repeatable source of like double strike, pump, and trample. And the 3 mana isn't that big of a deal because as you can see, we're playing 25 lands, which seems like a lot, but our lands do have some utility, like 17 mountains, no big deal. Ramanop Ruins, famously banned in Standard. You can just throw them at your opponent for 2 damage. It gives you a little bit of reach. The life loss normally isn't going to matter unless you're playing in the mirror or against mono black, but I feel like you probably have a pretty good matchup against mono black. So just throwing Ramanop Ruins at them is totally fine, and the 1 life isn't going to matter all that much. And it's an untapped red source too. Mutavault is our only colorless land that's in the deck, and it's basically like a card that's hard for control to deal with effectively. Like they have Azorius Charms and things like that, but like if they're charming a Mutavault to the top of your deck, while it does kind of feel bad, it it could definitely be way worse because it's something that they can't counter. Finally, there's Castle Embreth, which is another red source that the majority of the time isn't going to come into play tapped, and if it does, then we only have really 8 1-drops in the deck versus like the 2s and 3s that we have. So the fact that if this comes into play tap turn 1, that's fine. It also lets us pump our creatures too. So all those goblin tokens that we make, the fact that they go from 1 power to 2 power, or like Kari Zeb goes to 2 power and Ragavan goes to 3, things like that. Just those little incremental things when you don't have anything better to do with your mana that just help you push through damage and either trade up on your opponent's creatures or just close the game out really quickly. The sideboard, Tormod's Crypt, there's some decks that are playing a lot from their graveyard. Tormod's Crypt is a good answer because it costs nothing, and Mono Red doesn't really get a ton of good graveyard hate except for maybe Anger of the Gods to sweep away the creatures, but even that I don't think is that good when your deck is mainly full of creatures. So Tormod's Crypt is probably like the next best thing because you just outclass a lot of other creatures. Chandra's Defeat for the mirrors just takes out Glorybringer, Torbrand, any of their threats, and also deals with Chandra as well. So just really good, and then also has the added bonus of if it's a Chandra Planeswalker, you can discard a card and draw a card. Fry for the blue-white control matchups, dealing with their Planeswalkers, can kill Elspeth, can kill Big Teferi, can kill any of the little Teferis, Narset, all that fun stuff. Lava Coil for specifically, I'm assuming the aggro matchups, killing one of Mono Black's recursive creatures with a Lava Coil obviously gets rid of it, so usually that's good enough. Scab Clan Berserker, a 3-mana 2/2 that gets bigger if it hits your opponent, and while it's renowned, if your opponent casts a non-creature spell, it deals 2 damage to that player. Opting for this over like Eidolon of the Great Rebel, specifically for the fact that it is an aggressive creature, it gets in the turn that you play it, and against like blue-white, you could easily sneak this underneath of them, and then makes their counter spells and all their other spells really bad to play against you, because if it's not directly dealing with the Scab Clan Berserker and it deals 4 damage from its ability and then 2 from it, you dealt 6 damage for 3 mana, which is really good in a lot of cases. And then finally, one of Chandra, Torch of Defiance, just if you need to go bigger. I assume this is for like the mirror matches, for control, a card that control doesn't really deal with all that well. So just having another one of these that can slowly take over the game is also really good. And that's going to do it for Big Red in Pioneer. Probably one of the better, if not the best, aggressive deck that you could play in the format, just from how big you can go, how good your creatures really are. And a deck that like probably doesn't get punished too much by sequencing and things like that. If you just curve out, you keep some pretty good hands. You should have some pretty good success. It was played a lot in the SCG Pioneer Classic. You saw like 4 players. Even though you can't see their records or anything like that, they all did very well. I think there was like 2 or 3 in like their top 8. The GP had a ton in their top 8 for their Pioneer event. So definitely a deck that's going to be here to stay. I don't think or foresee any of these cards getting banned or being like even on a watch list. So, a lot of these cards are really good. And maybe we could see Glorybringer or Torbrand, possibly even like Goblin Rabble Master. But even like saying that out loud, it just doesn't feel like those cards are ban worthy. So yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to check out my other Pioneer deck text along with my modern deck text if you're into that sort of stuff. Follow me on Twitter. I post the links to all my videos when they get posted there. So give me a follow. You'll always see whenever a new video goes up, the minute that it goes up. Follow me on my Twitch channel. I don't do a whole lot of Magic stuff on my Twitch channel, but we do play occasionally. Just like to hang out, play video games, so that's really cool. And consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more deck tech stuff. If you want to see more Pioneer, modern, and standard content as well moving forward. I appreciate you guys watching the video. Have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next one.